This is Anime on the Sea to Sky, episode 3. The scheduling in between the first couple of episodes and now has been a little lopsided. Really had no idea how I wanted to schedule this out, so over the next couple of weeks I'm going to try and keep it out to a Sunday release schedule, recording it over the weekend and trying to put it out at the beginning of the week. Fingers crossed, more like famous last words I would assume, but at least I've got enough topics in the backlog to keep this running for quite a bit of time, and over the next couple of weeks I'll kind of see how I can keep up to that pace. So at least for this week, I was essentially looking back on the perspective of myself as an anime fan, getting into it in the early 2010s. Now, going back to one of my previous videos, or not videos, my previous podcasts, I was a guy that had VHS copies of Pokemon, of Digimon. I would be able to watch Cardcaptor Sakura on the Kids WB Saturday morning lineup. I had all these opportunities to watch all these different anime as they were coming out on broadcast and on home video, but I never really considered myself an anime fan of that regard, considering that I still had no idea what anime was. It wasn't until I realized that it was a completely different medium created by an entirely different set of people that I started to realize, okay, so this is a lot deeper and a lot more complex than I once thought. And jumping into the topic and kind of going back and forth a bit, I would say at the beginning of the 2010s, I would definitely call it the streaming generation of anime fans. And by a generational standpoint, I would say it's a decade-by-decade basis. Another one of the topics I'll probably go on a later date is essentially how the 2010s related to the 2000s, related to the 90s, and so on, considering that all the methods of consuming this kind of media have evolved and changed drastically over such a short span of time thanks to the advent of the internet, and that's an entirely other cast in of itself. But at least for today, starting on how I became a fan and picking off one of my previous casts, I still was initially an anime fan back in late 2012, I would like to say. That's when I got into it. Not through torrenting, not through buying DVDs, not through going through the majority of the standard methods, but now realizing that streaming was a thing. I mean, one of the first show that I ever watched and recognized as anime as something else that wasn't necessarily created in North America or licensed and to our demographic would have been Chrono Crusade, and I found that on the Xbox Live Marketplace in the summer of 2011. So I definitely did say 2012, but looking back on it, that was essentially when everything changed, and my perspective and view just got completely overrun and swapped at the blink of an eye. Through the Xbox Live Marketplace, I downloaded in this case bought with my own currency, the first 4 episodes of Chrono Crusade, and then looking it up online later, realizing that I'm pretty sure Funimation had uploaded the entire series, the entire 24-episode series, on their YouTube channel. And afterwards I'm thinking, okay, well, that was just a bit of money well spent. And leading into that, completing the entire series, jumping back into it, more and more searches on YouTube related to Chrono Crusade led into these Evanescence AMVs, or anime music videos, in comparison. And due to the recommendation system, all the AMVs recommended other AMVs, and I had a backlog of all of these music videos with all these cool new shows and bids that I had never seen before, but it gave me a list, it gave me a backlog of stuff that I wanted to go watch. And so, leading up after that, just simply searching X Anime Episode 1 on Google, this led me to my first, streaming site, which was illegal, of course. It wasn't Crunchyroll, considering that Crunchyroll even began its days as a pirating site and then legalized itself. I think it was in the late 2000s, early 2010s. It's just that they didn't have the library or the cloud, considering that this is now a legal operation. They couldn't necessarily have all of their stuff backlogged to a server and still give it out for free. That legitimately had to come into a sense of right and start paying for subscription services in the same vein as Netflix, and it all went through from there. But for the time, for the entirety of 2011 and 2012, it was all streamed. That's how I consumed all of my anime at that point in time. At some point in 2012, a buddy of mine pointed me in the direction of torrenting, and so with those, I was able to get much higher quality versions of the content that I was consuming, and I didn't have to worry about any of the internet issues that I had going through my house whenever I had to stream something, considering that it always required a decent connection. It always required for me to actually go through, and the majority of the time, the quality of the streaming wasn't as good as the majority of the options that were out there. 360, 480p around those bids. And you could get Blu-ray rips through torrenting at that point in time, which completely blew my mind. And so I focused more on movies for that specifically, going through torrenting, and then afterwards, it just continuously moved forward, watching 100% of my anime illegally until 2013, when I finally ended up getting a Crunchyroll account, and that took about 50 to 60% of my anime just off the bat. So now I was paying for the majority of my content, but even then, in the beginning of the 2010s, not as many shows were licensed, not as many of them moving into the streaming age were able to find themselves onto a platform where they could at least get their wide distribution set out. And so the majority of the time I just stuck on streams. And as the years went by, I would say I was still hard Crunchyroll and regular streaming and torrenting up until about 2016. So for a good 4 years. And afterwards, in January of 2017, people started pointing out Amazon trying to get in on the action and essentially creating their own service, Anime Strike, which was behind a double paywall. You needed Amazon Prime, and then you had to pay an additional monthly service in order to get Amazon Strike, or Anime Strike, and nobody liked that. Nobody in their right mind were thinking, look, we enjoy anime, but if you're telling me I'm going to have to pay nearly $15 a month just to watch one or two shows, I would have called you a madman. The only issue that I had with that is that whoever was in charge of licensing the specific shows out on Anime Strike, when they were able to get the exclusive license to those shows that were particularly airing, they picked the good stuff. They were really good at deciding which shows that they were going to be putting on their platform for that season, and that was the only reason. If they picked up just random, like niche, nobody would be watching these shows, then obviously nobody would have cared. Nobody would have turned or given them a second thought, but it's just that, look, they were picking up After the Rain, they were picking up Cabaneri, they were picking up Land of the Lustrous, and the biggest one I'd say they picked up in that time was Made in Abyss. Honestly, arguably the biggest show of 2017 they had under their umbrella. Thankfully, this didn't last. Anime Strike only went on for a whole year, from January 2017 to January 2018, but Amazon would continue to pick up titles, and they would continue to go for exclusivity over the course of the next few seasons, but it wasn't behind a double paywall anymore, and people legitimately started to give them a bit of clout and a bit of recognition, and Netflix, on top of that, was also getting into the bids as well, also going for exclusive rights. They weren't behind a double paywall, but they were, but the titles itself were thrown into what everybody has now coined as Netflix jail. If a show, the majority of the time, if a show was going to be airing in Japan, say the beginning of spring 2017, so April of 2017, normally you would not get that title for another 4 to 5 months after its initial release, and in this case, 1 to 2 months after it was over. And so everybody, myself included, were incredibly concerned, considering that by the time the show was out, and it was already pirated, considering that from the Japanese Netflix and from the Japanese streaming services, they could essentially just take rips off of that stream and still illegally stream it, illegally torrent it. It would have its time in the limelight, like every other series would, in the 3 months in the 3 months per season that they would go. And then by the time it finally came out on Netflix, it's like, oh great, it's in your catalog, nice. If it's not massive, then everybody's just going to let that sit and rot away inside your library, and barely anybody is going to take notice of it for a bit, because in comparison, the biggest difference between the 2000s and the 2010s, especially in the streaming era, is that it is within 24 hours. We are able to get the episodes and content within 24 hours of them airing in Japan, in comparison to months, if not years, that you would have to wait in order for you to get a licensed version of a specific show, or for it to be fans translated or fan subbed, and essentially like finally find its way onto the internet for people to download in the middle of the fan subbing era of the 2000s. Even if you were able to find the schedule of shows that were going to be out in that particular season, you would still have to wait months. And nowadays, in the advent of streaming and Crunchyroll and Netflix, the fact that you would still keep your own title behind a paywall, not a paywall, behind a 4 to 5 month window was just mind-boggling. And of course, it still does make sense considering that, okay, well, if we release it on the same day and we have we have the Japanese episodes with English and whichever other language subtitles going on day one, then what essentially is going to bring people back once 4 months down the line, we are able to bring it out with regular dubs in the programming and production that we had been using that time to essentially put out. And I completely understand that. But it's tragic when essentially you see anything that you were looking forward to now that we all have the charts, now that we can all go on Mal, on any chart, on essentially any other resource to go and look up what's going to be airing in the next season, just like that, and we will know if there's anything massive to be taken out. For me in particular, they've been able to put out a lot of big shows related to Trigger. Trigger definitely has something related to, or a contract related to Netflix, considering that the majority of their shows, including Little Witch Academia and BNA, have all made their way into Netflix jail, and that is the majority of the time where they get distributed. And then other shows like Dragon Pilot, Carol and Tuesday, Beastars, Great Pretender, as of the latest one, Great Pretender, are the ones that have essentially been going through. But thankfully, they still found these shows, regardless of what you do, piracy is always going to be an issue. It is always going to be relevant, and it is always going to be there. But at least in my comparison, due to at the end of 2012, when I was illegally streaming and downloading 100% of my content, I would say nowadays I'm only doing that with about 5%, with about 1 in every 20 of my titles, considering that now you have, unfortunately, you're spoiled for choice, because we're going back to the cable medium, essentially, that we've got Netflix, the different streaming services that you would be able to find exclusive content on a season-by-season basis. You're talking about 1 Netflix, 2 Amazon, 3 High Dive, 4 Funimation, 5 Crunchyroll, and it definitely gets exhausting at times. There are definitely a lot of these. Some of the streaming services I share with my family. Some of them I turn off for 3 to 6 months, when I know that I'm not going to be having any shows inside of their catalog that I'm going to be watching. So it's a little inconvenient in that sort of line. But the fact that now almost every single show can find a way to get licensed and distributed in a worldwide setting and audience is a fantastic evolution of how it's been able to go through. Now the biggest licensing challenge nowadays is going back into the annals of history, going back to the 90s, to the 80s, and some to the early 2000s to try and figure out a way to bring those shows into a legal light. Because, of course, you can find almost anything that you need as long as you're willing to download it and wait for it. But for a wider, broader audience, and a way for somebody to actually be able to get that onto their feed and be interested in something that came out 20 to 30 years ago, that's the major bid. Some of the outliers that I would definitely bring into that bid is that Netflix has been really good at bringing back long-running and large shows, and the most notable bid that came out last year in 2019 was Evangelion, one that had been caught in licensing and rights hell that had a limited number of physical copies being released that are now sold for hundreds of dollars online, and there was no legal way for anybody to find or consume the show until Netflix picked it up, redubbed it, and was also able to get the 2 movies that related to it. Death and Rebirth and The End of Evangelion, because you need both of those films. Not the first one, but End of Evangelion, you needed that to be part of the entire Evangelion experience. Even if the ending was already there for Evangelion, they needed to include the end of it just so people would actually be able to experience it for themselves. It's been, I think in 2017, Violet Evergarden was streamed everywhere, including in Canada, to everywhere except the States. And so that was kind of unfortunate for them, but at least they were able to pick up these large-scale shows that definitely have a following, or notably somebody went through. So like Carol and Tuesday, you had Shinichiro Watanabe and Yoko Kanno. With Violet Evergarden, it was the newest and highly acclaimed and highly sought-after show coming out of Kyoto Animation. There was a backing of fans. There were definitely people that were going to be interested in that regardless of where it was. And whoever was on the team for Netflix definitely had a good pickup there. And then leading into 2018, they definitely started off the year with a bang in terms of Devilman Crybaby. And that was on the minds of everybody on YouTube, on Twitter, on essentially every other platform that you could use to discuss that kind of show. And it all just dropped out in one go, and everybody consumed it, and everybody was just gobsmacked at how somebody would have been able to make this. Masaki Yuasa is definitely one of my favorite directors at this point, and I'm so glad that he was able to find international success in that kind of series. Japan Sinks nowadays in 2020, I definitely had some problems with it. It was fine, but I would still put it on a recommendation to get that out there. In terms of Canadian Netflix, the fact that just earlier this year we were able to get the entire Ghibli catalog just all set up, everything with Miyazaki, everybody with Isao Takahata, just everything by Ghibli, finally on the way through. Because Disney was really good at licensing all of these films and getting their distribution over the course of the 2000s and the 2010s. Same for in vain, regardless of Nausicaa. That was interesting. Please don't have any cuts. But the fact that that is now all available for us to consume, and for me to like point anybody in any which way to just say like, okay, watch these films. They're all on Netflix now. And I think it's HBO Max for the US, so they've had it for quite a while, but now Netflix has the opportunity for a handful of other countries to essentially bring that into their catalog. So that was good. So just how streaming was able to become the modem or the major means of consuming media is honestly amazing at this point in time now, in terms of the convenience and how many people are able to jump through at such a simple bid with such a simple price. I really don't hope that we have to go through the majority of times where we keep jumping back into the cable mod, and we're going to be having more and more streaming services. I think the amount that we have sitting right here is fine. I would like to see I would just like to see more and more classics come back in their way, and more people looking back on it. So it's just the advent of streaming and giving people the means to actually go through this instead of having to wait for download and find torrent and, you know, who's going to source it, who's going to seed it, who's going to leech, and essentially all of those things. While not complicated and not really much of a wall for a huge wall of entry, is still just kind of like, yeah, you need a computer, you need a decent internet connection to at least consume the majority of the stuff that everybody's going to go through. So at least there is that kind of bid to bring people around now that there are more and more options for people to jump into it. And so yeah, I think just the comparison at this point in time, going back, even knowing that downloading existed, knowing that Flash was still an opportunity to go and at least still appreciate and enjoy this medium in a different degree, but would also lead me into what I would consume early in the 2010s, jumping through. It was still, looking back on it, it's just the ease of access. It's distribution. The fact that I walked into these sites and realizing that the internet had given me unlimited access to every piece of content, every movie, every show, whether they were coming out seasonally, whether they had already been like out of print for decades. The fact that that was all sitting at my fingertips in front of a 16-year-old kid who previously only had DVDs and VHS tapes to go and watch all of these stuff, it was just a mind-boggling moment at that time. I would honestly like jumping back into the VCR stuff. I'll probably focus more on this on a different topic and a different cast and a different episode, but I don't know. I'm pretty sure we sold off our VHS copies, but I'm pretty sure I had the first 20 episodes of Pokemon on VHS. I had the Digimon movie. I had the first two Pokemon films, and the rest I never did get to go see in theaters. But they would always be at Rogers Video. They would always be a way for me to rent those movies every single time a new one came out, and it was like, okay, that's my night. Same deal with renting video games, same deal with renting music. Well, not necessarily renting music. That was the only, in terms of the advent of streaming in the 2000s for music, that was definitely something that I didn't jump onto at the time. My dad was getting into iTunes. I was downloading and forwarding his entire CD collection into iTunes just so he would be able to have a library to take around with him. Like, that kind of stuff was legitimately fascinating at the time. But now realizing that I could do with visual media instead of just music was honestly insane. Although I will admit the first CD that I ever bought for music was the SSX3 soundtrack because I played that game so much. Oh, man. So I guess the last terms of bid that I want to talk about with the streaming generation, now that everything is just so convenient and now everybody has the opportunity to just pay a simple monthly subscription and have everything at their fingertips, it's definitely gotten to the point of, I would say, the only concern I have with streaming at this point, now that almost 100% of the stuff that I consume is of legal tender. The last bid that I would talk about in terms of streaming is just film. And anime films in the early 2010s, there were a handful of shows. There were a handful of movies. Anywhere between 2012 and 2000, you would find 1 to 4 anime films localized and being released in theaters for a year. Come 2013, 2014, that went up to 7, but I was still in the midst of nearly consuming everything by legal means. Even though I had a Crunchyroll account, movies were a lot more difficult, considering that not all of the movies that were related to this content that I was enjoying would have made it all the way over to the seas. We would have to wait for Blu-ray rips coming out from Japan, and somebody would rip it and then distribute it and then sub it, and then we would be able to go through all of the shonen films, so all the Bleach films, all the Naruto films. I watched all of those through downloading torrents. And the first half of Ghibli's catalog, same deal. And I'm trying to think if there was one other major movie that I could think of, because I never did watch, I guess, one of the Pokemon movies, but that was only because the Rogers Video that we had was closed, and I was kind of just interested to see where it was going at that point. But that kind of had its time, and it moved on. Nowadays, from 2017 onwards, after the release of Your Name, every single opportunity that I have for a movie that is going to be coming out in theaters, the majority of the time it goes to the US first, but Canada, we still have the opportunity, even though not as many, and that has been fixed, and it has been getting fixed over the past couple of months or years for equal amount of cinema releases for Canada and the US. It's getting better. But now that option is there, I don't think there is any other reason for me to jump back into torrenting anime films, because the legal option is now there. Before, in the early 2010s and into the mid 2010s, there was no other possible reason for me to watch these films other than buying the DVDs consistently. But with the amount of stuff that I was consuming, there was no way I'd be able to pay for it. So nowadays, now that I have money, now that I have time, and now that the option is there, now that you can legitimately go out to your own theater, even though it is limited screening, I do understand that. Not everybody is going to be able to find the time, considering that a lot of these either come out for a Sunday or a Wednesday. Why Wednesdays? The option is now there, and you can legitimately pay. You can now pay the distribution companies. In this term, I would really like to thank Fathom Events, G Kids, 11 Arts, everybody doing their best to give the most amount of options and the most amount of content to bring over here, which otherwise people would just say, oh yeah, in which otherwise that we could just download a month or two after the movie comes out and then we could just watch it in the comfort of our own home. And I used to understand that, but now I don't. I cannot understand why, now that the legal and legitimately good option is there, why you wouldn't actually take the opportunity to go out and see it for yourself. A lot of people I can still see they don't want to go into a public setting to watch these kinds of films. I can definitely understand that. Although watching My Hero's first movie, watching Konosuba's first movie, the energy and the atmosphere inside of that cinema was more than enough of an experience, and something that I would never be able to get just sitting at home and watching with a buddy or two. It is not possible to actually have that experience unless you go out. And if you're not trying to go and find that experience, that's definitely understandable. If you are completely, if you are just streaming and torrenting every other option under the sun that you have at your disposal, fine. But it's just, if there's anything that you can do at that point in time, is not complain when things don't go your way. If the movie is, if you're in the middle of a rural town in the States and the nearest theater is 2 hours away and you have no legitimate way to go through, then you know what, dude, go for it, torrent it. That's definitely fine. But if you have the opportunity, at this point in time, going into the 2020s, where the advent of streaming is now the modem of choice, and everybody is doing it, and everybody has the opportunity, and we still have all those, subscriptions necessary to go through. Look, go out and see it for yourself. Now that we have the time, and now that we have the money, we now have the ability to pay and show these people that, hey, we appreciate what you're doing, and we have legitimately want to spread this and give as much of a positive rap for it as humanly possible. And now that the opportunity is in our hands, that is honestly something that I would legitimately want to see pushed a little further. Honestly, in terms of the other priorities and projects that I was thinking on, I'm probably going to do a small video on how it used to be the best time to be an anime fan for cinema. 2020 definitely swapped that around, don't get me wrong, and it's not going to be normal for over a year, but at least in terms of Made in Abyss's previous endeavors, and the fact that they were able to get a virtual screening and give everybody the opportunity to go out and see this film at home, and it's just, hell yeah, no, it was $20. It's like, dude, you would pay $20 for the movie ticket, for the snacks, for the gas, or the transit in order for you to get over there. $20 is a steal. It is a glorious price for you to not only watch it once, but you have the ability to watch it for 24 hours after it is all over. You can still rewatch it and go back if you legitimately enjoyed the film, which is what I did. So I'm going to see how this weekly bid turns out. Probably try not to stretch it out to hour-longs and kind of do what I'm doing now, around half-hour bids. I'm going to try, and I'm going to see if I can keep this pace up and go at a weekly rate, which definitely seems like it's still going to be an endeavor. I do have enough backlog, I do have enough stuff to talk about, but it's all going to be a matter of time just to kind of see if I'm going to have to go from weekly to bi-weekly. I don't think it will ever stretch out to monthly, but honestly, we'll just have to see. So thanks for listening, and have a good one.